The fire was a malevolent eye in the vast, crushing darkness of the prairie. It spat embers that died like falling stars against the immense, indifferent canvas of the night, hunkered in the deep shadow of a lonely mesa. Jesse watched, the cold of the ancient rock seeping through his worn duster and into his bones. It was a familiar cold, one that had been his companion for 5 years, ever since he'd shoveled the last spade of dirt onto his father's grave. His hand rested on the staghorn grip of his Colt, a gesture so automatic it was no longer a thought, but an extension of his being. He wasn't looking for this kind of trouble. His trouble had a name, a face, and a laugh that haunted his dreams. Silas Kane. But the West, in its infinite and cruel wisdom, had a habit of throwing other people's nightmares in your path, just to see if your own had taught you anything. 3 men, their shapes warped and monstrous in the firelight, passed a bottle. Their laughter was a harsh, ugly sound that tore at the sacred silence of the plains. They were drunk on cheap whiskey and the intoxicating power of cruelty, and at the center of their pathetic little stage, tied to a crude stake, was a woman, Comanche. Jesse could tell by the intricate patterns of the beadwork on her doe-skin dress, a splash of defiant beauty in a tableau of grime and menace. Her chin was lifted, a small, proud fortress of defiance against the tide of her fate. He didn't know her name was Tima. He only knew that the look in her eyes, a blazing, unbroken silence, was a look he recognized from the hollowed-out man who stared back at him from his shaving mirror each dawn. It was the look of the haunted, of someone who had lost everything but the ground on which they stood. Vengeance had been Jesse's compass, his catechism, his only reason for drawing breath each morning. Silas Kane was the sin. A bullet from Jesse's Colt was to be the absolution. Everything else was a distraction. This should have been a distraction. But it wasn't. Perhaps it was the sheer, lazy brutality of the scene, the way the leader, a corpulent man with a beard caked in old grime, kicked dust at her feet. "Your chief is a stubborn old fool," the man slurred, his voice thick with liquor. "He'll sign over that valley, or we'll start sending him his daughter back, one piece at a time." The words meant to break her seemed only to straighten her spine. A spark ignited in the cold, dead hearth of Jesse's soul. It wasn't heroism. It was a flicker of disgust so profound it demanded action. The 5-year hunt for Silas Kane could wait for 5 minutes. He moved like a wraith, his worn boots making no sound on the sandy earth. He'd learned long ago that the desert was his greatest ally. It taught a man the value of silence and surprise. A low, sharp whistle, the cry of a hunting nighthawk, cut through the air from the rocks far to their left. It was a trick an old Apache scout had taught him, a simple manipulation of a drunk man's attention. As 2 of the men turned their bleary eyes toward the sound, Jesse closed the 20 yards between them in a silent, deadly rush. The heavy cow-blued steel of his Colt's barrel met the first man's temple with a sickening, wet crunch. He collapsed without a sound, his fall lost in the fire's crackle. The second man, younger, his face a mask of sudden, sober terror, fumbled for the pistol at his hip. He was too slow. Jesse's knife, a tool he usually reserved for skinning game, slid between the man's ribs with a practiced, economical motion. It was a brutal, intimate kind of violence, and a wave of self-loathing washed over Jesse at the ease with which he performed it. The leader, still squinting into the darkness, finally turned. Jesse's forearm was already there, a band of iron crushing his windpipe. The man's struggle was a brief, desperate dance against the inevitable. Silence, profound and heavy, returned to the prairie, broken only by the hiss and pop of the flames. Jesse knelt before Taima, his knife now a tool of liberation. He sawed at the thick ropes, the fibers parting with a dry, rasping sound. Her wrists, he saw were rubbed raw and bleeding, the skin broken. She didn't flinch or cry out. Her dark eyes, luminous in the firelight, tracked his every movement, not with gratitude, but with an intense, unnerving assessment. He was not her savior. Not yet. He was simply the victor, and she was waiting to see what kind of man he was. As the final rope fell away, a small, heavy object, tucked into a fold of her dress, slipped out and landed in the dust with a dull clink. It wasn't a piece of jewelry or a tribal fetish. It was a key, forged of old, pitted iron. Its head was crafted into a complex, coiled symbol he didn't recognize. As she instinctively reached for it, her fingers brushed the back of his hand. The contact was a spark of warmth against his cold skin. A brief, human touch, so unexpected, it sent a jolt up his arm. In that exact, suspended moment, a rifle shot shattered the night. The fourth man. The lookout. Jesse reacted without thought. He grabbed her arm, the skin surprisingly smooth beneath the grime, and pulled her with him, away from the treacherous light of the fire and into the consuming, absolute darkness of the open plains. His simple and straight line of vengeance had just been irrevocably twisted into a tangled knot, and at its center was a silent woman and a heavy iron key that felt like the weight of a world he never asked for. The night was a chaotic, breathless flight through a landscape of unseen threats. Thorny scrub tore at their clothes while unseen rocks threatened to turn an ankle. Behind them, the shouts of the remaining lookout and the sporadic crack of his rifle grew fainter, swallowed by the vastness of the plains. Jesse, driven by years of being both hunter and hunted, set a grueling pace. He was a man who had not only grown comfortable with solitude, but had cultivated it as a shield. Yet now, the soft rhythmic fall of Tima's moccasins behind him was a strange and unsettling counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. It was the sound of a life he was now, however unwillingly, responsible for. They found shelter as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. It was a shallow cave carved into the face of a butte, a wound in the rock that offered a brief respite from the world. They were no longer pursued, but they were fugitives, adrift in an unforgiving wilderness. Two strangers bound by a shared baptism of violence. As the harsh light of a new day filled the cave, it revealed the toll of the night. Tima's dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, but her eyes were clear and alert. Jesse saw a deep exhaustion in her, but it was banked like hot coals, the fire of her will still burning brightly within. He felt a grudging respect. He had seen hardened men break under less pressure. He built a small, smokeless fire from dry mesquite, the flames a fragile bastion against the morning chill. He offered her his canteen and a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag. She took them with a slight, formal nod, her movements economical and graceful. Her gaze kept flickering to the iron key, which he had retrieved from the dust and now lay on a flat rock between them. A silent, brooding presence. It seemed to draw the meager light to it, its coiled serpent design holding secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. "Those men," he said, his voice a low rasp that scratched his dry throat. "They're part of Silas Kane's outfit." He hadn't meant to say the name. It was a poison he preferred to keep to himself, but the events of the night had lanced something in him, and the name had spilled out. He watched her face for a reaction, but she showed no recognition. "He's a man who buys up land, people, whatever he needs. The men who follow him are curs, fighting for the scraps he throws them." He found himself talking more than he had in months, the words filling the silence, perhaps to convince himself that his 5-year obsession was justified. Tima finished her water and carefully screwed the cap back on the canteen before answering. "A man is known by the dogs he keeps," she said, her voice calm and measured, with only a hint of an accent. "But you," she added, her gaze sharp and penetrating, locking onto his. "You are not one of his dogs. You hunt the master." The observation was so direct, so accurate, it left him feeling exposed, as if she had peeled back his skin and looked at the raw anger beneath. "My ghosts are my own business," he growled, the defensiveness rising in him like bile. She did not look away. Her stare was not accusatory, but deeply, unsettlingly perceptive. "In my culture," she said softly, "when you save a life, you tie your spirit to theirs until the debt is paid. Your ghost is now my business, too. Jesse Mercer." He froze. His blood ran cold. He had never told her his name. He was sure of it. How do you know my name?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively closer to his Colt. Taima's expression remained serene. She reached out and gently tapped the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "J.M., she said, tracing the faint carved initials in the worn walnut stock. "Your father was Jonathan Mercer, a man who came to our lands many seasons ago. He spoke of peace. He was a man of honor." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a convergence, a circle closing after 2 decades. The key on the rock between them no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a judgment. The simple act of cutting a woman free from her bonds had just tied him to the one part of his past he could never outrun: his father's. The revelation that Taima knew of his father hung in the air between them, thick and heavy as summer humidity. Jonathan Mercer, a man of honor. The words were a balm and a sting. Jesse had carried the memory of his father as a martyr, a simple good man murdered for a patch of worthless land. To hear him described with such reverence by this stranger, this woman whose life he had just saved, was to see that memory through a different lens, one that revealed colors and depths he had never known. Taima explained that the story of the honorable white man who had treated her people with respect had become a quiet legend among the elders, a cautionary tale of a broken promise. It was this story that had given her the courage to trust the initials on his rifle. Their journey to the abandoned church was no longer a flight, but a pilgrimage. Taima led them, not with a map, but with a series of seemingly obscure landmarks she'd learned from her grandfather's stories. A twisted juniper that looked like a dancing man, a rock formation that resembled a sleeping bear. It was a map of memory, a path invisible to anyone but her. Jesse, a man accustomed to navigating by compass and stars, found himself yielding to her quiet certainty. He watched her. The way she moved with the land instead of against it. The way she could read the slightest disturbance in the dust and know if it was made by a snake or a lizard. A fragile, unspoken trust began to grow between them, nurtured by the shared silence of the vast, empty landscape. After 2 days of hard riding, they found it. The church was a crumbling adobe skeleton, its bell tower leaning like a man bowed by grief. The setting sun painted it in hues of blood and gold. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of forgotten decades and the faint, ghostly scent of incense. It was a place of profound silence, a tomb for a faith that had long since departed. "My grandfather, Black Moon, met your father here," Taima said, her voice a near whisper, as if not to disturb the spirits that lingered in the shadows. This was to be a neutral ground, a sanctuary where 2 worlds could speak as one. Jesse's practical eye scanned the decaying pews and the sand-covered altar, searching for a chest, a lock, a hiding place. He found nothing. But Taima was not looking with her eyes alone. She was reading the room, searching for the intersection of history and intention. She pointed to a series of faded, peeling frescoes on the wall beside the altar. They depicted biblical scenes, but with a strange, syncretic twist. The angels had the wings of hawks, and in the background of a nativity scene, there were buffalo. And there, almost hidden in a depiction of the Garden of Eden, was the serpent, coiled not around a tree, but around a simple iron key. "It's a story," Taima breathed, "not a map. The key is not the way in. The key is the story." Jesse was about to dismiss it as mystical nonsense when his gaze followed the painted serpent's tail. It pointed downward, toward the heavy flagstones of the floor. But there was nothing there. He knelt, running his calloused fingers over the stone, feeling for a seam, a loose block. Nothing. He looked up at Taima in frustration. She was looking at the opposite wall, where a single narrow beam of afternoon light lanced through a crack in the adobe, illuminating a small, specific spot on the floor. It was a place he had already checked. "Your people see the world in straight lines," she said softly. "Mine see it in circles. The sun, the seasons, life itself. The story begins where the light ends." He went to the spot. It looked no different from the rest of the floor, but when he put his full weight on the stone, it shifted, sinking a fraction of an inch with a low, grinding sound. A puff of ancient dust billowed up. Working together, they managed to pry the heavy flagstone loose. Beneath it was not a cavity, but a second, smaller stone, and set into its center was a small, square depression. It was not a keyhole. Jesse looked at the ornate, coiled head of the key in his hand. With a dawning sense of understanding, he knelt and fitted the head of the key into the depression. It clicked into place perfectly. He turned it. It didn't unlock anything. Instead, with a deep, resonant groan from within the walls, a section of the timber frame beside the altar swung slowly inward, revealing a dark, hidden cavity. And there, bolted to the very foundation of the church, was the squat, iron safe. The sight of it sent a shiver down Jesse's spine. It was real. As he inserted the key's bit into the ornate lock, his heart hammered against his ribs. The tumblers, frozen by time and rust, protested with a series of loud, painful-sounding clicks before finally, with a solid, definitive thunk, the mechanism turned. He swung the heavy door open. The disappointment was immediate and sharp. No silver, no deeds, just a single, leather-bound journal. But as he reached for it, Taima gasped and pointed to the inside of the door. Scratched crudely into the iron were two sets of initials, side by side, like a pact. Sa K and J M, Silas Kane, and Jonathan Mercer. The ghost he had been chasing had just led him back to the father he thought he knew. The journal felt like a block of ice in Jesse's hands, a cold weight of history that seemed to sap the warmth from his fingers. The leather cover was dry and cracked like old earth, but the elegantly tooled initials, J.M., were a visceral link to a past he suddenly felt he knew nothing about. He opened it, and the scent of aging paper and dried ink, a smell he associated with his father's study on quiet evenings, billowed out, a phantom from a life that now felt like a dream. He expected the words inside to be foreign, the thoughts of a man he was just beginning to understand, but the looping, slightly slanted script was as familiar as his own name, and for a heart-stopping moment, he was a boy of 10 again, watching this same hand sketch a map or pen a letter. Taima knelt beside him, her presence a silent vigil in the dusty, sacred space. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a small point of contact that kept him anchored to the present. He began to read aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper that seemed too loud in the cavernous silence of the ruined church. The first entries were just as he expected. Meticulous notes on geology, detailed sketches of rock strata, observations on water sources. It was the logbook of Jonathan Mercer, the methodical, intelligent prospector. But as he turned the pages, a narrative began to emerge. The first mention of Silas Kane described him as my partner, a man of formidable ambition and charm, whose eyes seemed to see the value in everything, perhaps even in men's souls. Then came the name that made Taima draw a sharp breath: Chief Black Moon. My mother's father, she whispered, her voice filled with a stunned reverence. The great chief. The story that unfolded in his father's careful handwriting was not one of simple greed, but of a breathtaking, almost naive vision of a shared future. Chief Black Moon, a leader of profound foresight, had seen the coming tide of white settlement not as an end, but as a moment for transformation. Rather than face annihilation through war, he proposed a radical partnership. He had secretly offered to lead Jonathan Mercer and Silas Kane to the Motherlode, a massive vein of silver that ran through the tribe's most sacred canyon, the heart of the world. In return, Mercer, with his education and legal knowledge, and Kane, with his political connections, were to use the initial profits to secure an ironclad, federally protected title to the entire Comanche territory, preserving their lands and their way of life for all time. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a bridge of trust built between two worlds over a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. Jesse's voice grew thick with emotion as he read of his father's growing admiration for Black Moon. He is a statesman, in a way our own politicians could never comprehend. One entry read, "He does not think in terms of years, but in generations. We spoke last night under the stars, not of silver, but of our sons, and the world we might leave for them. But a thread of darkness began to weave its way into the narrative." The handwriting grew slightly more hurried, the words underlined with a new urgency. Silas has changed. He speaks of the Comanche as our wards, and of the silver as our payment for civilizing them. He chafes at the terms of our agreement. He met today with men from the railroad. He told me it was nothing, but I saw the lie in his eyes. The final pages were a frantic, desperate descent into betrayal. The elegant script became a jagged, barely legible scrawl. Kane has been poisoning the well. He holds secret councils with the younger, more aggressive warriors, telling them that Black Moon is a fool, that he is selling their ancestors' birthright for a piece of paper. He is igniting the very fire we sought to quench. Jesse had to pause, his throat tight, before reading the final, chilling entry, dated the day before his father's murder. Silas knows I have documented our entire agreement in this journal. He confronted me at the claim this morning. He called it my Book of Foolish Dreams and laughed. He said the deal was dead. He has a new plan, one that requires Black Moon and myself to be silenced, to be turned into martyrs for a conflict he himself will orchestrate. He will take the silver, the land, and twist our dream into a justification for war. He said, "History is written by the victors, Jonathan, and I intend to be the victor. I have hidden the book in the one place of trust this land has ever known. May God forgive me for my blindness, for trusting a man with no soul." Jesse closed the journal. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent church. The clean, righteous fire of vengeance that had been his only fuel for 5 years was gone, extinguished by the cold, muddy flood of truth. His father wasn't a simple martyr. He was a partner in a shattered utopia. And Silas Kane was not just a murderer. He was a demon of a new age, a man who didn't just steal lives and land, but who stole the very possibility of a better world. He looked at Taima. Her face was a mask of grief, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were the last surviving heirs of a forgotten peace, and the weight of that legacy, of that monumental betrayal, now rested squarely on their shoulders. The desert became a purgatory. Every sunrise, which had once been a simple marker of another day, closer to his goal, now felt like an indictment. The truth of the journal had not set Jesse free. It had imprisoned him in a far more complex and painful reality. The ghost of his father was no longer a righteous figure urging him toward revenge, but a tragic one, whispering of a failed dream. He was the son of a man who had tried to build a bridge and had been thrown from it into the chasm below. That knowledge was a heavier burden than any saddlebag. He found himself rereading passages from the journal at night by the firelight, torturing himself with the hope and optimism in his father's early entries, a hope that now seemed like a fatal flaw. Taima, too, was wrestling with her own ghosts. The journal had recast her grandfather, the legendary Chief Black Moon, from a powerful warrior into a forward-thinking statesman, a man whose vision had been too grand for the violent, greedy world he inhabited. The betrayal had come not only from Cain, but from within her own tribe, from the seeds of dissent he had so expertly sown. This shared, complicated grief forged a new, unspoken intimacy between them. They began to move as one, anticipating each other's needs without a word. He would gather firewood while she found a source of clean water. She would patch a tear in his duster while he reshod one of their horses. They were two solitary people, learning the forgotten language of partnership. The sandstorm that descended upon them was less an act of nature and more a manifestation of the chaos that raged within them. It began as a smudge on the horizon and grew with terrifying speed into a churning, roaring wall of sand that devoured the sky. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging grit. Visibility dropped to zero. It was a blind, primordial fury. Jesse grabbed Taima's hand, a desperate instinct against being separated and lost forever in the howling abyss. They stumbled together, finding shelter in the lee of a large rock formation, a tiny pocket of relative calm in the heart of the tempest. They huddled together, their horses a solid, trembling wall behind them. The universe reduced to the deafening roar of the wind and the sting of sand against their exposed skin. It was in this crucible, where the world had been stripped away, that the final barriers between them were obliterated. Pressed close against the storm's fury, Jesse found himself shouting, his words almost ripped from his lips by the wind. I spent 5 years feeding a simple hate. It was all I had. It kept me warm at night. He confessed it all, the emptiness that drove him, the way vengeance had given his pointless life a purpose. I thought killing Cain would make me whole again, but it won't. The man my father was, the dream he had. Killing Cain won't bring any of that back. Taima turned her face to his, her dark hair a wild flag in the wind, her eyes intense and clear despite the swirling chaos. No, she shouted back, her voice a powerful counterpoint to the storm's roar. But living for that dream will. My grandfather believed the world was a circle. An act of violence creates a debt. An act of vengeance only deepens it. Only an act of justice can restore the balance. In the heart of the tempest, surrounded by the elemental fury of the world, Jesse finally understood. His quest had been selfish. It had been about his pain, his loss. The true debt was not to his father's death, but to his father's life, to the idea he had died for. As the realization washed over him, he felt the tightly coiled knot of hatred in his gut begin to loosen for the first time in 5 years. Taima, as if sensing the shift in him, reached out. Her gloved hand covered his, a firm, grounding pressure. It was not a gesture of pity or romance, but of absolute, unwavering solidarity, a silent vow made in the eye of the storm. They were no longer the children of betrayed fathers. They were the guardians of their legacy. And the storm, both inside and out, began to pass. The dawn that followed the sandstorm was pristine and silent. The world felt scoured, baptized. The air was crisp and cool, and the sky was a deep, impossible blue. A similar clarity had settled over Jesse and Tima. The grief had not vanished, but it had crystallized into a diamond-hard purpose. They were no longer reacting. They were planning. The journal, which had been a source of pain, was now their sharpest weapon. They would not use it to expose Cain to the law. The law was a slow, uncertain thing in these territories, easily bought by men with silver. They would use it as bait, turning Cain's own paranoia and greed against him. They found their messenger in a dusty, fly-blown cantina in a small settlement that was little more than a smudge on the map. He was a man with shifty eyes and a reputation for carrying messages for anyone who could pay. The negotiation was swift and took place in a shadowy alley behind the cantina, with the cold, persuasive muzzle of Jesse's Colt pressed under the man's chin. An hour later, the messenger was riding hard for Cain's territory. In his pocket was a pouch heavy with silver and a single, carefully selected page from the journal, a page describing, in Jonathan Mercer's unmistakable hand, the precise location of a secondary silver vein. The message was simple. The rest of the book, containing the full details of the original agreement and Cain's treachery, was for sale. The price, sole ownership. The buyer had to be Silas Cain, and he had to come alone. The meeting place, the ghost town of Redemption. Redemption was a monument to failure, a gold rush town that had boomed and busted in the space of a decade. It was now a collection of skeletal buildings groaning in the constant wind. It was a place where dreams had been buried, the perfect graveyard for a man like Silas Cain. As they rode down its single, dust-choked street, the echo of their horses' hooves was the only sign of life. They had 2 days. They used every minute. This was not Jesse's plan alone, nor Tima's. It was a fusion of their skills, a deadly duet. Jesse, the gunslinger, thought in terms of tactics and ambushes. He chose the saloon as the centerpiece of their trap, noting the heavy, rust-chained chandelier and the clear line of sight from the second-floor windows. He found a crate of volatile, sweating dynamite in the abandoned assayer's office, and, with painstaking care, rigged a small portion of it to a tripwire across the entrance of the bank opposite the saloon. Tima, the hunter, thought in terms of the landscape, of deception and misdirection. She moved through the decaying town like a ghost, her feet silent on the rotting boardwalks. She identified the strongest rooftops for a sniper's perch, the hidden alleys for escape routes. It was her idea to use the sun-bleached mannequins from the abandoned dressmaker's shop, placing them in shadowed windows with broken pieces of wood cradled like rifles. They would draw fire, create confusion, and make their 2-person army seem like a dozen. They worked with a focused, synchronized intensity, the shared purpose a powerful, unspoken language between them. The night before Cain was due to arrive, they sat by a small, hidden fire in the ruins of the livery stable. The air was electric with anticipation. The trap was set. Now, all that was left was the waiting. Jesse watched Tima sharpen her knife, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on whetstone, a calming, meditative sound. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, from a bloody campfire to this final, desperate gambit. Tima, he said, his voice quiet. After this, what will you do? She paused, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I will go home, she said simply, and I will use my grandfather's story to lead my people, Not as a warrior, but as a peacemaker. I will try to finish the bridge your father started to build." She looked at him, her gaze direct. "And you, Jesse Mercer? Will you go back to hunting ghosts?" He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of his violent, empty years. "No," he said, the word feeling strange and new on his tongue. "I reckon I'm done with ghosts." He reached into his duster and pulled out the old iron key. He held it out to her. "This belongs to you, to your past." Taima looked at the key, then back at him. She shook her head, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. "My grandfather said it would open the past," she said softly. "But with you, it has opened a path to the future." She closed his fingers over the key. "You keep it, to remember that even in the darkest places, there is a way forward." As dawn broke, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dead town of Redemption, they were ready. They were no longer two people. They were a single, unified purpose, waiting to bring justice to a place that had forgotten its name. The silence in Redemption was a physical presence. It was the deep, expectant quiet of a theater before the curtain rises, the held breath of a predator before the strike. From his vantage point in a grimy, shattered window on the saloon's second floor, Jesse watched the empty street. The sun was climbing, baking the dust to a fine, white powder. Below, on a poker table riddled with bullet holes from some long-forgotten dispute, the journal lay open, its pages ruffling in the slight breeze that ghosted through the building. He couldn't see Taima, but he knew exactly where she was, nestled in the shadows of a collapsed roof across the street, as still and patient as the stones around her. They came just before noon, a dozen riders appearing as a shimmering mirage on the heat-hazed horizon. The mirage solidified into men and horses, a grim procession kicking up a plume of dust that was their only herald. Silas Kane rode at their head, not with the caution of a man walking into a trap, but with the swagger of a king entering a conquered city. He had brought his entire force, a clear violation of their terms. Jesse felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Kane wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to exterminate. Kane dismounted, his expensive silver-inlaid boots sinking into the filth of the street. He surveyed the dead town with a sneer. A man whose soul was so empty he could only feel contempt for the failures of others. "Find them," he commanded, his voice sharp and imperious. He sent half his men to sweep the buildings, while the other half held the street. Kane himself strode into the saloon, his spurs ringing a discordant chime on the warped, uneven floorboards. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, went immediately to the journal. He approached it slowly, savoring the moment. A wolf circling a long-awaited meal. He ran a gloved finger over the worn leather cover, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. This was the final ghost, the last piece of a past he had tried to bury for 20 years. As his fingers closed around the book, Jesse let out the sharp, piercing whistle of a nighthawk. It was the signal. Kane froze, his head snapping up. In the same instant, two things happened. From the rooftops, an arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, hissed through the air and slammed into the table, pinning the sleeve of Kane's expensive coat to the wood. Simultaneously, the man who had just stepped through the doors of the bank across the street hit the tripwire. The world erupted in a deafening roar as the dynamite charge blew, sending the bank's heavy wooden awning crashing down into the street, scattering men and horses in a cloud of dust and panicked chaos. The ghost town became a slaughterhouse. Kane's men, disoriented and terrified, fired wildly at the mannequins in the windows, their bullets wasted on wax and wood. From his perch, Jesse's colt barked, each shot precise, each one finding a target in the swirling confusion below. Across the street, Taima was a phantom of vengeance. She moved between vantage points, her bow a silent, deadly instrument. An arrow would appear from a window, another from a rooftop, sowing terror and death among Cain's men. They were fighting phantoms, and they were dying for it. Jesse fought his way down the saloon's creaking staircase, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder. He and Cain were finally face to face, separated by the length of the ruined bar. Cain, his face a mask of incandescent fury, had ripped his sleeve free and was firing his matched set of silver-plated revolvers. "Mercer's boy," he screamed over the din of battle. "Your father was a weak, sentimental fool, babbling about trust and honor. This land doesn't reward dreamers. It rewards men strong enough to take what they want." His words were cut short by a final, choked scream from the street outside. Taima had finished her work. They were alone. The final showdown. Cain knew he was beaten. In a last, desperate act of spiteful nihilism, he hurled one of his pistols at Jesse as a distraction and lunged for the journal, intending to throw it into the fire of a burning lantern that had been knocked over in the chaos. He would not be caught, but he would ensure the truth died with him. Jesse had a clear shot. He could end it all. The 5-year quest, the burning hatred, the ghost of his father whispering in his ear for vengeance. He raised his Colt. But in that frozen moment, he saw Taima appear in the saloon doorway, her face streaked with grime, her eyes locked on his. He saw in her face not a demand for more blood, but a plea for a different ending. He saw the future. He made his choice. He shifted his aim upward. His bullet didn't strike Cain. It struck the thick, rusted chain holding the massive iron and crystal chandelier. With a tortured, grinding screech of metal, the great fixture, a relic of the town's brief prosperity, crashed down. It didn't kill Cain. It buried him, pinning him to the floor under a crushing weight of iron. His legs broken, his reign of terror over, trapped, defeated, alive to face the justice he had so long evaded. Jesse lowered his pistol, the smoke curling from its barrel. He had not taken his revenge. He had claimed his father's legacy. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the West, it is easy to believe that strength is measured by the speed of one's draw, or the hardness of one's heart. But the most profound strength is often quieter. It is found in the courage to trust when you have been betrayed, to show mercy when you have been wronged, and to build a future from the ashes of a painful past. Jesse and Taima did not find a fortune in silver, but they unearthed something far more valuable, a shared truth that redeemed the legacies of their fathers. They learned that a past of violence does not have to dictate a future of bloodshed. By choosing justice over vengeance, they broke a cycle of hatred and planted the seeds of a new beginning, not just for themselves, but for the very land they fought to protect. In the harshest of landscapes, they discovered that compassion is not a weakness, but the most resilient and powerful force of all. Their story, whispered on the winds that sweep across the plains, reminds us that true legacies are not carved in stone or written in ledgers of gold, but are forged in the quiet moments of grace that define who we are.